smoking cessation, and tobacco and nicotine product policy. So here's my declarations of interest. And for the purpose of this talk, it's important to state that I do not work with the tobacco nor the e-cigarette industry, but I do receive salary support from Cancer Research UK, and I've also had my research funded by the National Institute of Health Research, the Medical Research Council, and the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham Council. So I'm going to give an overview of what smoking is, where we are currently in England, what are e-cigarettes, who uses them, what for. I'll give some background information around efficacy from trial data and effectiveness at a population level. And I'll also discuss some issues around safety and unintended consequences of e-cigarettes and common problems with e-cigarette research and general misperceptions of e-cigarettes. So I'm going to set this presentation alongside a guiding set of principles or rules, if you like. And this is because, for those of you that know, e-cigarettes research has largely become a kind of partisan science that is fraught with misrepresentation of data and widespread misunderstanding about the products. So these rules, I think at least, and this is not an exhaustive list, there are others, but these are the rules that I think for this talk help us to maintain some balance and appreciate the wider context that e-cigarettes are part of. So I'm going to set this alongside these principles, which are: never discuss e-cigarette use without the comparator of smoking. Think about smokers as a broad group and know who is smoking. Know what is and what isn't an e-cigarette. I think this is essential. And discuss relative risk to smoking, not absolute risk. And understand the harm that is done when claims are made that are not substantiated by the evidence. And a golden rule is to always look at the population data. And this is a kind of golden rule because at the current time, not always, but in some incidences with some negative consequences, smaller observational studies are being used to demonstrate wider points and to make broad claims. And I think it's important that we triangulate the evidence with population level data to get a holistic picture. So for this talk, I'm going to be using a lot of data from the Smoking Toolkit study. This is a rich data source which provides population level insights into smoking and non-combustible nicotine product use in England, and it's been running since 2006. And each month between 1,700 and 1,800 different adults in England over the age of 16 are asked a series of questions about their drinking, nicotine and smoking. So before I start, I am going to discuss smoking a bit with you, and that is because we should never discuss e-cigarette use without the comparator of smoking. First and foremost, e-cigarettes are designed as a harm reduction alternative to smoking. They are designed and regulated to be used by smokers as part of an armour that can bring an end to smoking. But many of the issues around e-cigarettes, of which there are many, and some of which I'll touch on today, are created when people study or discuss e-cigarettes in isolation from smoking. And that is problematic because I think, at least, and I'll happily take questions on this, but the best evidence for their existence and use and potential is found when we look at what is happening with smoking in England. I can hear someone's background noise, so if everyone could just make sure they're muted. Thank you. So where are we at the moment with cigarette smoking prevalence in England? Well, we're at a really good place in England. Rates are at a historic low of 14.7%, which you'll see here. E-cigarettes became widely available in the UK in 2010. Well, not widely actually, but they became available in England in 2010. And there were a few people using them. And we do now in England have people that have been using them for up to a decade. But they became more widely available here in 2013. And this is an important starting point because much of the concern around e-cigarettes is that they might undermine quitting or even act as a gateway or ramp on to smoking. Ramp on's this quite trendy term that people use now. But if this were the case, then what we would see is either this slope not declining or going back up. And as you can see here, that hasn't happened at all. So from just looking at this, you know, we can see that e-cigarettes have not undermined England's progress in reducing smoking prevalence. So that's a good thing. One area of particular concern has been young people, and I will talk a little bit more about young people in a few slides on. Because we know that if people start in youth, and the longer that they smoke, the more likely they are to accumulate health problems because of their smoking. But also, the longer people smoke, the less likely they are to quit, and the more difficulty that they'll have in quitting. But smoking prevalence amongst youth has also been falling in England now for many years, with a slight bump up here and there, as you'll see. But generally, the trend has been a decline in England. And we do have one of the most comprehensive tobacco control plans in England. And central to this has been the reduction in smoking prevalence amongst people under 21. So one of the concerns when e-cigarettes became widely on the market, again, around here at 2013, was, well, would they act as a gateway back into tobacco smoking? Would it undermine the efforts that we've made in reducing smoking prevalence rates? Would the co-use of nicotine products and any association mean that people go from using an e-cigarette onto a cigarette? And actually, if we look at the data, yes, it's bumpy, but generally there has been a downturn. So in case you're interested, smoking by sex, men still smoke at a higher rate than women, but women, men and women generally follow the same trend. So since e-cigarettes came available and widely available in 2013, we did see a slight uptick in people that reported stopping smoking in the past 12 months. Again, this is data taken from the Smoking Toolkit study. So this is people reporting that they had made a quit attempts in the last 12 months. So the point here again is, are e-cigarettes halting or interfering with the rate at which people make a serious quit attempt? And no, they're not. So taking all these slides together, it starts to give us some convincing data and answers some questions around the general fears or folk tales that exist about e-cigarettes and how they might interfere with the progress that we've made with smoking. And in case you're wondering, here, the last slide here, we see 8.5, there's been an uptick. In case you're wondering, this is the COVID effect. Okay, so this year there's been highly publicised campaigns to help smokers quit for COVID. And it appears to have been quite effective. As you know, or you might know, that COVID-19 has a particular nasty impact on people's respiratory health, as does smoking. So there was a real sense of urgency within public health to try to run campaigns that helped people to quit smoking. And it seems to have worked by taking this data. But turning to my area of interest now, to really understand why e-cigarettes and of course other nicotine replacement therapies are important, we must understand who is smoking and why. And this is another one of my guiding principles. Yes, smoking is a killer. It kills 200 people a day in Great Britain, and really diminishes people's quality of life, but it will kill you faster and make you more unwell for longer the poorer you are. And as Michael Marmot has said in his landmark review, and now 10 years on, that our health is closely linked to the conditions in which we live, we work, our access to other healthy resources. And if we don't have this access to these healthier resources, and we're in a position where our quality of life is compromised, this gives rise to inequalities that keep people in an unequal position in life. And from a psychological perspective and from a behaviour change perspective, this makes shifts in behaviour to more positive behaviours much, much more difficult. Now, smoking is strongly associated with deprivation, and smoking cessation, at least in the long term, is much more unlikely the poorer you are. In England, we have, as part of the tobacco control plan, which I mentioned earlier, we have a goal to reduce smoking prevalence by less than 5% by 2030. So we've only got a decade now to realise that goal, just shy of a decade to realise that goal. And I think keeping that in mind, if we want to achieve this, we need to be really serious about the evidence on who's smoking, what smoking is going to look like in the future, and what products will play a part in helping us to get to that endpoint. So we need to use all of the tools available to us to really help and assist with the most disadvantaged people in our society. So back to the smoking toolkit study, here's the same graph that you saw before. So this is everybody in England. And like I said, smoking prevalence rates are at 14.7%. That's good. But up here, we have adult smokers from routine and manual occupations. And down here, adults in professional to clerical occupations. So we see here that those people from the lowest socioeconomic status groups are presenting smoking prevalence rates which are double those who are from the more advantageous sectors in society, if you like. So yes, we are seeing a decline across all of the socioeconomic status groups, but there's still this double prevalence rate within the lowest socioeconomic groups, and this will, and this is causing what we refer to as tobacco-related health inequalities. You could say, and many do argue, well, maybe those people that are in the lowest socioeconomic status groups are less motivated to quit. We don't see that. Okay, we don't. We see that it follows the same trend. So the patterning is very similar. So it doesn't explain the divide. So then other people say to me, well, maybe people from the lowest socioeconomic status groups don't make as many attempts to stop smoking. But again, that actually doesn't explain the divide either. People in the lowest socioeconomic status groups are making as many quit attempts to stop. So this divide is because of other social health related factors. And we need to, I think, start to understand what those factors are and how we can support people to quit smoking when they're facing often difficult lives. So these inequalities are wider and at risk of widening in those who present with multiple and severe disadvantages. And I'm talking about here, and this is where my work really sits, in adults who are experiencing homelessness, adults who present with a serious mental illness or present with substance use disorders. And if we're not careful, these are the smokers that we really risk leaving behind, because even in these groups, motivation to quit is actually no different to those people who are not experiencing those problems. So you see here, smoking prevalence rates in England, 14.7, and then up here, they're extraordinarily high. And we did some work, we ran a cross-sectional survey of adults who are accessing homeless support services, and we looked at quit attempts and we looked at motivation to quit, and we found no difference at all within this group to people who are not experiencing homelessness. And actually the people that responded to our survey were making quite a lot of quit attempts, but those quit attempts were unaided by either pharmacotherapies or behavioural support, and they were short-lived. They lasted for less than 24 hours. So another thing we need to understand is that for many people in these groups, smoking is a last pleasure. Okay, and this is something that I've written about quite extensively. I published this in The Psychologist this year. And in this piece, I was arguing, it was around COVID, but nonetheless, the points more broadly are, they carry within and without of the COVID context. For many, and I think this is what people don't kind of understand sometimes. We're living in a society where for some people, the only pleasure that they have every day is a cigarette, and that is access to something that is actively harming them with every use. And as a psychologist, I try not to judge that, but I seek to understand it. And as someone who believes in harm reduction, as I do, I believe helping to find people ways to change their behaviour, which is not punitive, which is not making moral judgments on what people are doing. And I say that because when I write these articles, I often get a flurry of sometimes angry emails in response, where people will say to me, you know, it's a good point that we should be supporting people to quit and to use aids. And I'll come to e-cigarettes in a moment, I promise. But, you know, I quit cold turkey, or I was able to quit with just behavioural support, and that worked for me. And great, I think that's fantastic. But I do ask people, were you at that time on a 0 hours contract, living in cramped conditions or in insecure housing? Were you in and out of prison? Did you, you know, was you struggling with your alcohol or other drug use? Because this is the point, really. These are the people we need to keep in mind, because when we get to that point where we've got fewer than 5% of the UK or the English population smoking, we've got to think, who are those people and what are the health and social needs that these people will have? And I fear that we're heading to a future where smoking will be a real behavioural marker for social inequality. And so the late, great Mike Russell, an esteemed academic, recognised this in the 70s and 80s, so even before I was born. He knew that smokers needed a viable alternative to help them quit, that methods needed to capitalise on people's often short-lived motivation and opportunity. Now, cigarettes are incredibly good at delivering nicotine into the bloodstream and into the brain. So the act of combustion and inhalation into the lungs means that nicotine is delivered within seconds. And this helps smokers feel relieved from craving sooner and gives people this nice stimulatory effect. And Mike Russell knew that cessation aids needed to rival the cigarettes, traditional cigarettes, in several ways. So writing in 1991, he says here, it is argued here that it is not so much the efficacy of new nicotine delivery systems as temporary aids to cessation, but their potential as long-term alternatives to tobacco that makes the virtual elimination of tobacco a realistic future. And that these products need to be made as palatable and as acceptable as possible and actively promoted on the open market. So unlike other methods of cessation, which offer nicotine for the purpose of helping to come off cigarettes, and then they're often prescribed to help people then reduce their nicotine, and that's fine if that's your goal. What he's saying here is, for some people, and perhaps the groups I'm referring to, though I don't want to make judgments and we need more evidence on that, but for some people, we need long-term effective methods to be an alternative, because it might surprise you, as it did me when I first started working in smoking cessation research, that even if you've been abstinent from smoking for 6 months, there's still a 70%, over 70% chance that you will relapse back to smoking. And, you know, tobacco, cigarettes, tobacco pouches, they're still widely available. So what he's also saying here is, it's not even just that these products need to rival cigarettes in terms of their delivery, their nicotine delivery, they also have to be widely available. But the really important point here that he makes is that they also have to be palatable. These have to be products that deliver nicotine effectively, they're widely available, and they're palatable. Now, some of the licensed nicotine replacement therapies that we currently have, actually, you know, they do deliver nicotine really effectively, such as the inhalator or the mouth spray, but they're not always palatable to people. People tell us that they don't like them. So delivery of nicotine is one thing, but of course, when you're trying to give up a behavior, which, you know, many people do many times a day, and they're really attached to, they have to find this attachment to something else. And he knew this, and this is why he really was a visionary. He also said that smokers smoke for the nicotine and they die from the tar. And this is one of his most famous sayings. So again, it's about decoupling nicotine from the tar. So voila, we have the e-cigarette. So another rule of mine is to know what is and what isn't an e-cigarette. And e-cigarettes are defined as handheld electronic vaping devices which produce an aerosol formed by heating an e-liquid. All of these here are e-cigarettes. We have the e-pipe, that is an e-cigarette, and the e-cigar, they are e-cigarettes, but they've just got different casing. Then these ones here are rechargeable tank device. Well, these two, sorry, are tank devices. They're pretty good at delivering nicotine. They're refillable from the top. They have quite a lot of power and good battery, which means that the capacity of that means that they can produce the aerosol and they can deliver nicotine quite effectively. Then some people like the fact that these tank devices do produce quite a lot of aerosol. Some people don't. Then you've got these medium-sized tank devices, which are quite popular and often sold as a starter kit. Again, they're refillable, so you'd buy an e-liquid and you'd refill that. Then you've got these are rechargeable, but they're not necessarily refillable devices. They come with these small little pods that you put in, and these ones here are you would charge them by a USB, and they're quite discreet, these ones. And I've worked with vapors in studies where they will use a real mix of these different devices. They might use one of these types of tank devices at home that produce the plumes of vapor because they quite enjoy that, but when they're out and about and they want something a bit more discreet, but they want to still be using their e-cigarettes so that they don't get cravings, they'll move over to these more discreet ones. And then here we've got these disposable e-cigarettes, which, you know, are pretty abysmal at delivering nicotine because the battery on them is, you know, it's not really powerful enough to be able to heat the e-liquid, and there isn't really an atomizer that can deliver the nicotine into the user in a way that they're going to get a great hit. The problem is that I've found is that smokers will often choose this disposable e-cigarette first off because it looks like a cigarette and because they want something that is quite cheap to start with, but it looks familiar and people think that it will be familiar to them. But it's really disappointing because it's got such a low power battery in it. So what ends up happening is that people will try these disposable ones and then say, oh, actually, I didn't like it. I tried an e-cigarette and I didn't like it. So this is why it is important that we do have this range of devices on the market for people so that they can try and buy. Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a huge rise in the availability of reduced risk nicotine products, of which e-cigarettes are one. They're here. And this slide is taken from Clive Bates, and it classifies vape products into those that heat nicotine, a nicotine-containing liquid, those which contain tobacco, but that it's heated, and these are commonly called heat not burns. And then we have these oral nicotine products. Some of these are the licensed medicinal nicotine products. And then you've got these nicotine pouches down here like Zyn, which are quite new to the market in the UK. And then we've got smokeless tobacco products. So these products themselves all contain nicotine. These contain tobacco and these ones don't. And they all span this continuum of harm. But importantly, none of them involve burning, and they're all considerably less harmful than smoking. Up here, you'll see in the nicotine vaping based products, we also have ones here like these electronic hookahs and the small shisha pens. And while these do produce an aerosol, and they do also produce nicotine if people put nicotine in the solution. It's important that we know that just because you can vape it, it doesn't make it an e-cigarette. And this is one of the most common misperceptions that I'm finding in the literature at the moment. Water pipes, THC vapes, cannabis vaporizers, they're not e-cigarettes, okay? And they shouldn't be mistaken for one. And this is a common issue that we're finding, especially from some of the data that's coming out from the US in youth surveys, where young people are asked about products that they vaped. The data is not being disaggregated well. And we see that the researchers will present the data as products vaped in the last 30 days, and say 50% of young people has vaped these products, but it's not clear what products people are vaping. So the literature is quite messy around what it is that some people are vaping, especially around the literature on youth use. So it's really important that we do know that just because you can vape it, it doesn't make it an e-cigarette. And I'll come to a slide at the end of why this is especially salient point in the current climate. So if we look at support used in a quit attempt, weirdly, given the variety of products available in England at least, up here we see that people are still choosing to quit with nothing at all. So, you know, e-cigarettes are not a panacea. They haven't necessarily come onto the market and dominated and helped as many people to quit smoking as we might like them to. And I'll talk about why that might be the case later on. But they are actually the, you know, the #1 quit choice now in England. And here we have NRT. So e-cigarettes are they become increasingly popular in 2013 as a quit aid. But still, you know, they're rivaling or just about over what NRT was in its heyday. So what about prevalence of e-cigarette use amongst smokers and ex-smokers? Okay, so here we see this is people that have used an e-cigarette at any time. And this is the percentage of people who are using an e-cigarette daily. So we still have people using an e-cigarette more infrequently than we do daily. And this is potentially problematic because literature is now starting to show that the more frequently that you use your device, the more likely you are to quit. Or in other terms, daily vapers are much more likely to be exclusive e-cigarette users compared to people who don't use their e-cigarette daily, who are concurrently still smoking alongside their e-cigarette use. And down here we have use of Juul, which is an e-cigarette, but it's a different type. It's the pod device that I was showing you, and heated tobacco products down here as well. And unlike in the US, Juul hasn't really taken off in the UK. And I think that's because when it came onto the market, which I think was about 2 years ago now, the UK already had an established vaping market, and vapers were already quite happy with the products that they were using. It's also not widely available. And unlike in East Asia, heat not burn has not taken off in the same way that it has elsewhere. So I think for heat not burns, I can totally understand why a vapor wouldn't use them. So for those of you that don't know, heated tobacco products are, you know, they're a tobacco product. You have like a small type of, it looks like a cigarette. You put it into the device. A metal rod heats the lookalike cigarette, and that produces this. You know, it heats the tobacco and it creates this vapor, and it tastes and smells just like smoking. So I can understand why a vapor wouldn't want to use those. Why would you go from your, you know, cherry menthol to you know, going back to this taste of tobacco? But I'm not really sure why smokers aren't you know, using their heat not burn, and especially those who have tried an e-cigarette and don't like it. A theory I do have is that it's not widely available, and as Mike Russell said, these products need to be widely available. But also, because it's a tobacco product, it is subject to a type of tobacco duty. And that means that it doesn't necessarily have that price advantage. And, you know, for some people, they might just feel, well, if I'm not going to save money, it's not widely available, it just seems quite an effort. So what about nicotine use by never smokers? And this is one of the top contenders for concerns around the existence of e-cigarettes. People say to me all the time that they know people that have never smoked who are now vaping, and I don't doubt that. But this is one of those points, again, where we need to look at the population data to understand, is this a big problem? Do we need to start to implement some policies to mitigate against this? So the answer really is no, we don't seem to have a problem at a widespread population level. So here we have, these are long-term ex-smokers. So yeah, they're long-term ex-smokers who are e-cigarette users. Okay, so that's who's using e-cigarettes. Down here we have long-term ex-smokers who are using NRT. And down here we have never smokers who are using an e-cigarette. And we have down here never smokers that are using NRT. And it's important to show you this because nicotine product use of all types is taken up by never smokers. This is not something that is exclusive to e-cigarettes. And yet, this is where there is so much concern. And this is why it's always important to compare what e-cigarette use to what's happening with smoking, but to also have a look at never use across different, to measure current product use against the whole range of nicotine containing products. So, you know, people do use NRT and they do use e-cigarettes if they've never smoked. And yet, you know, we never heard the kind of outrage about never smokers using NRT. So I hope that's clear. So I just now want to turn our attention to quitting with e-cigarettes. And this is really a quick potted, you know, tour of this, and then I'll go on to some unintended consequences and safety. And I want to show you this data from the first randomized controlled trial of e-cigarettes versus NRT within the English Stop Smoking services when both were offered alongside behavioural support. And it's important that we triangulate the population data, which I've just shown you, with trial data, because population data, I suppose, does have the caveat of where these are people that were motivated and consciously chose to go out and buy an e-cigarette. What about if people are randomized to an e-cigarette or NRT? So it reduces these residual confoundings, if you like. So, okay, where are we? So 886 smokers were randomly assigned to receive an e-cigarette or licensed nicotine replacement therapies. They were provided with a starter pack. It was a second generation refillable e-cigarette with 1 bottle of nicotine e-liquid. And they were also given this recommendation to purchase further e-liquids. And then everybody received up to at least 4 weeks of behavioural support. The primary outcome was 1 year sustained abstinence, and this was validated biochemically at the final visit, so that's a CO breath test. And to make sure that the most conservative methods are used in understanding the quit rate, intention to treat analysis was employed. And what that means is those people that did not come back for a follow-up visit were treated, or lost at follow-up, were treated as smoking, and that's the most conservative method. And encouragingly, at 1 year, 18% of those within the e-cigarette arm had quit smoking, and 19.9% of those within the nicotine replacement therapy arm. And the conclusion was, from Peter Hayek and colleagues, e-cigarettes are more effective for smoking cessation than NRT when both are accompanied by behavioural support. So that's good. Taken with the population data, this is encouraging. And there's been convincing and growing evidence based now on e-cigarettes within trials in many countries, and I won't go into them here because I don't have the time, but also I'm trying to concentrate on England. But this has led the most recent Cochrane review that was updated just last month, I believe it was published now, which is the gold standard in reviews, to conclude that e-cigarettes are an effective method to help smokers quit. And specifically, the points that they raised were that quit rates were higher in trials where smokers were offered a nicotine-containing e-cigarette versus an e-cigarette with no nicotine. I can't talk too much in detail why that is, but if you have a question, please do raise it. So, you know, the finding is that nicotine was important, and also that quit rates were higher with those who were offered an e-cigarette compared to those who just were offered behavioural support. So, you know, we're seeing some really good, strong evidence coming out. One issue that was raised in the Cochrane review was that many of the trials included were earlier trials which had offered smokers these disposable, low power, ineffective nicotine delivery devices. So as we have more trials and people are offering e-cigarettes to people which we know are much more effective at delivering nicotine, the evidence base could actually get stronger. So this is encouraging, and this is why it's important that we, with good regulation, of course, encourage the devices to continue to evolve so that they can, you know, effectively help people to quit smoking. But I think it's important, and I'm just going to turn my attention a little bit to unintended consequences in more detail. And this is around the issue of youth use of e-cigarettes, particularly amongst never smoking use and attitudes towards smoking more broadly. There are several important questions, specifically if the wide availability of e-cigarettes have renormalised or displaced youth smoking. So are e-cigarettes having a negative impact on the efforts we have made in the UK to make smoking a less permissive and less socially desirable behaviour? So this is an important study that was led by colleagues at Cardiff, and they explored these questions by analysing repeated cross-sectional data from just over 248,000 young people across England, Scotland and Wales. And what they found, one of the questions that they've asked was around, let me have a look, what did they? Okay, so this is around the predicted probabilities of regular smoking. So we know that there's been a decline in youth smoking, and they asked people retrospectively to report their smoking. And this red line here is where smoking is when e-cigarettes came onto the market, so around 2010. And as you can see by these predicted probabilities, there's still this nice slope. So, okay, as we saw before, e-cigarettes or the emergence of e-cigarettes onto the market do not appear to have had a negative impact on young people's smoking behaviour. So, but one of the issues is around, well, does e-cigarette use encourage people to think that smoking is okay? And again, this red line here from 2010, when e-cigarettes emerged onto the UK market, we see a nice slope. Does it have an impact? And again, no, it actually continues to drop off. So this is important because these are grave concerns that people have around, well, what if young people are going to start using nicotine in I guess, a much more fun and accessible way? Will this introduce people to tobacco? And this seems to suggest not. Okay, but what about youth use of e-cigarettes? So same research group, different paper. We can't deny that young people have been using e-cigarettes, but this is an interesting mixed method paper by the group, and they show, and again, I can't go into it all, but it's retrospective analysis, that there was certainly a growing trend in e-cigarette use. And this red line here is the implementation of the Tobacco Products Directive, which limited nicotine strength in e-liquids, it limited device tank sizes, and added health warning labels onto e-cigarette products. And what they show here is that there was this kind of increase, but then it tapers off. But the authors are not, they're a bit cautious in saying that this is completely attributed to the TPD, because this is why this triangulation of data is important, because in their qualitative work, the young people report that they felt that e-cigarette use was an initial fad. It was quite fashionable, but actually it was then started to be associated with, people's parents or people that they didn't necessarily want to emulate. So it's important to have good regulation, and it's important to monitor youth use, but it's also important to look at these larger samples and to triangulate what's happening at a population level with these mixed methods qualitative studies. But we do have some important questions, I think, around youth use, which we can come to. I'm not going to answer them here, but these are questions that I've been thinking of, and those of us that work within tobacco harm reduction often think about. And that's this issue of what level of nicotine use will we tolerate as a society? What is it that we're looking for, and what is our end goal? Is it none or some? And if it's some, how much? And what if smoking is largely eradicated by other forms of nicotine use? What population level of nicotine use would we tolerate? So let's say that youth nicotine use was actually quite high, but smoking prevalence was around 2 to 3%, like it is in Sweden. Would that be okay? And I don't think that people have clear answers to that, but these are the sorts of things we need to be thinking about. And an area that I'm really interested in is how do we balance protecting young people and access to products whilst ensuring that established adult smokers can use nicotine products? So I'm happy to take questions on these, but these are just broad issues that surround the topic area. So I'm just going to quickly move on and give a whistle. This is really a whistle-stop tour of safety. And thanks to my colleague Leon Shahab for loaning me these brilliant slides. So moving on to some of the next concerns, and I do appreciate I'm going over lots of issues and not into much depth, but I think that all of these things are important, and these are all the what ifs that I come across. So I'm trying to answer all these what ifs. The first thing to say about safety is, yes, there is a paucity of studies around the long-term health effects and safety of e-cigarettes, but that doesn't discredit what is known so far. It just means we need to carry out more research. And some of you may be familiar with Public Health England's stance on e-cigarettes from a review of the very early literature. They estimated that e-cigarettes carry no greater than 5% of the risk of smoking, but many argue that that wasn't based on enough evidence. So moving forward, one of my principles or rules is that when we think about, or we're talking about e-cigarette harms and safety, we always compare relative risk to smoking. So since Public Health England released that stat that was within that report, Leon Shahab and colleagues published, I would call this a landmark study. Oh, it's 2 studies across 2 papers, and I'll go over both of them. So study 1 was to assess exposure to nicotine and well-known smoking-related carcinogens and toxicants in long-term e-cigarette users relative to NRT users and cigarette smokers. Okay, so we're looking at the reductions, if any, in carcinogens and toxicants. So, if we can estimate the reduction, that will help us to get a better estimate of the relative risk of e-cigarettes compared to smoking. And that should help people to feel maybe more satisfied with Public Health England's current recommendations. And then study 2, which is also important, is to assess the exposure to nicotine and well-known smoking-related carcinogens and toxicants in long-term e-cigarette users relative to never smokers, and to determine the effects of dual use on exposure. And dual use is important because actually people do, I think some smokers feel like they can use e-cigarettes or other nicotine replacements as a way to cut down their smoking, but not necessarily quit. And that raises important questions of, are there any health benefits to be had from doing that? So this was a pragmatic cross-sectional study that was run in London at UCL. Participants were purposely selected by diverse methods, so newspaper, Facebook, marketing companies. The groups were recruited in London. They were smokers. They were single users, ex-smokers of either NRT or e-cigarettes, or they were dual users. That was that they were smoking alongside NRT or e-cigarettes. So, first question is around nicotine. So as Mike Russell said, and as I've hopefully explained, these products will be attractive to people if they deliver nicotine in a way that is satisfactory. So this red line here and the red line throughout all the coming slides is going to represent smokers, because we're looking at the percentage difference. So in NRT users, the nicotine metabolites, they're good. And in e-cigarette users, they're good. Okay, so that's one good thing. There's no differences in nicotine intake amongst any product similar to conventional cigarettes. So what about harmful chemicals? And again, we're looking at the percentage drop. So we've got here nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are a cause of lung cancer. Here again in smokers, NRT users, e-cigarette users. And we see a significant reduction in nitrosamines in NRT and e-cigarette users compared with conventional cigarette smokers. So that's good. Here we have acrolein, which causes respiratory problems. Again, we have smokers in the red line, NRT users, e-cigarette users. Okay, so we see significant reductions there. Okay, then what about other toxic volatile organic compounds? CMYA, common one that is detected in smoking risk studies. NRT users, e-cigarette users. And what about the reductions? So we see great reductions there. And then carbon monoxide, we all know about the well-established links of CO with cardiovascular disease. It's a real killer in smokers. So again, we have NRT users, and then we have e-cigarette only users. And then again, we see a real reduction. Here in study 2, they add people in who dual use. Yeah. So that is people that smoke and use an e-cigarette. And as I've said, this is potentially problematic because the idea is that we want people to quit tobacco. We know that tobacco smoking is associated with so many harms. And again, we've got nitrosamines here. Let me just go back to that. And you can see here that the real, yes, there is a reduction in e-cigarettes and cigarette users, but the real reductions are to be had. We've got non-smokers here and e-cigarette users there. And the real reductions are to be had when people completely switch or are not using any products at all. But there's a substantial difference here between e-cigarette with a cigarette and cigarettes. And again, with acrolein. Now, acrolein can be found in other products foods, etc. So that's why, in case this looks a bit strange, you shouldn't be too concerned. And again, with CMYA. So this was a really important study that showed that yes, there is a substantial difference in relative risk compared to smoking between e-cigarette users and smokers, and also that there wasn't too much difference in the safety profile between e-cigarettes and NRTs, where there was no significant safety profile, but that if people wanted to get the substantial health benefits, they needed to completely switch, and we need to help people to not be dual using. We want people to completely switch to e-cigarettes. So E-cigarettes, you know, they're not a panacea, and we need to be realistic in what we're dealing with. Smoking kills 200 people a day in Great Britain, but it also diminishes quality of life. It's expensive, and that, alongside the other health effects, means that it has a real impact on health inequalities. And I think hopefully what I've been able to show, although I've not quite finished yet, is that e-cigarettes are effective at delivering nicotine. They're popular. They offer a harm reduction alternative. You know, the evidence from trials also shows that they do help people to quit smoking. And yes, there might be some unintended consequences around youth use, but we need to be pragmatic in how we deal with that. And we need to be balancing the evidence of harms and risks against making sure that products do not become out of reach to those people who I mentioned earlier will really need them in the future. And, you know, you would be forgiven for being confused about e-cigarettes and for having a negative opinion. What you can see here is just some of the headlines which have caused damage to the science. And I can tell you that as someone that does a lot of work in this area, those of us in the tobacco harm reduction field spend a lot of time trying to minimise the damage of these sensationalist headlines. And, you know, these headlines, they go both ways. So we've got one here that shows, you know, e-cigarette vapor has no toxic effect and is as safe as air. Well, you know, it's not. We've seen that. We know it's not, and we don't want to be careless. But by far the evidence, or these sensationalist headlines distort the evidence in the other way and say that e-cigarettes are no safer than smoking tobacco, that vaping is bad as fags. And then we have this one here in the middle. This was an incident towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, where vaping of illicit THC in THC vapes, so these are THC vaporizers, they're not e-cigarettes, but they caused you know, death in some cases, but widespread lung injury. But early on, and actually still now, are being attributed to e-cigarettes. They're not e-cigarettes, but yet they're written up within you know, the broadsheets as being caused by e-cigarettes, and that's had really damaging effects. And our group have been monitoring the impact that these headlines have on people's perceptions of e-cigarettes, and it's not good, and I'll show you that in the next slide. But I have to say that, you know, many of these headlines, they don't just come out of thin air. They are often based on bad science and badly written, careless press releases. Too often researchers are, you know, I would say not employing these golden rules that I've tried to, you know, have as a theme throughout this presentation. So they're not knowing what e-cigarettes are. They're not comparing harms and risk and the presence of harms to tobacco smoking. They are they're looking at youth use, but they're not looking at the population level declines. So it's really, really troubling that we the science is not being represented accurately. And many public health organisations and charities in England, across the UK even, do endorse e-cigarettes, and that's a good thing. But despite that, you know, smokers' perceptions of the harms of e-cigarettes across Great Britain has got worse. And this is a survey that's run by Action on Smoking and Health. And you'll see here that this is in 2020, the number of smokers believing that e-cigarettes are more or equally as harmful as cigarettes has actually increased. You know, and I will go back to that is, I would say this is largely because of these sorts of headlines. So it's a problem. And I find this slide just, you know, staggering. I've not you know, not this slide, but this figure here. And if I were, you know, if I was to play devil's advocate, if I was an investor in combustible tobacco, you know, I'd be really pleased with this result. So We've really got a duty to clean the science up, but we've also got a duty to remember that when we're discussing e-cigarettes, we're thinking about the end game of ending tobacco smoking. So I'm just coming to an end now, but I just want to quickly mention how this has an impact on our hardest to reach smokers. And I've been running a Cancer Research UK funded study of smoking and vaping policies across homeless centres in the UK. And one of the questions, we're just coming to the end of the survey now, but one of the questions has been around barriers within the homeless sector of implementing e-cigarettes within their service provision. And this is a sector that's already really up against it, and austerity's really hit this sector hard. But people have said to us, and I think this perfectly sums it up, to be honest, it's a lot to take on, especially when it's not our number one priority and we're not up to speed on whether we're doing the right thing by giving them out. Now, this is a group, as I showed in the earlier slide, where smoking prevalence rates are up to 80%. So it's a real concern that people who are working within the sector do not feel comfortable about offering e-cigarettes to a group of adults that could really benefit from trying to cut down and quit. And in our NIHR funded work, when we first started to offer e-cigarettes versus usual care to adults accessing homeless services, and that paper's published now, you can go and read that elsewhere. But this participant said to us when we offered the e-cigarette intervention, oh, this is definitely a government initiative. They're going to run a test on the homeless. They've probably got a dodgy batch of e-liquid and they want to see if it takes anyone out before they put them up for sale. Now, obviously, vulnerability and nervousness within this population in general aside, I think what we are starting to see is that the misinformation is having a negative impact at grassroots level. So e-cigarettes, I think, can be summed up at the moment as this vulnerable promise. In line with Mike Russell's vision, e-cigarettes represent one of the many tools, if you like, within the armour to leave smoking behind. And if regulation is right, we can protect youth, but we can also promote products to smokers who really need them. But this is a vulnerable promise, as I say, and like many of the harm reduction initiatives or interventions that have come before, it seems we're going a long way wrong before we get it right. And in many countries now, there are heavy restrictions or indeed bans on e-cigarettes, such as in India and Thailand. And these are, again, countries where smoking prevalence rates are incredibly high and people are living in extreme poverty. So I'll leave it there. And I just want to say thank you to the conference organisers, not a conference, but to the organisers of this talk for asking me to come along. And I'm now happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. Great to hear you talking, really informative. And I just, should have said this right at the beginning, really. This was Dr. Sharon Cox from UCL, who's a senior research fellow at the Tobacco and Alcohol Research Group. And I've known Sharon for quite a number of years now. So it's great to hear you talk and be so informative for us about the use of e-cigarettes. There's been a number of questions in the chat. I'm going to sort of take them in reverse order. And this is from Zoe Shuttleworth. She says, is there any data that looks at what young people, I assume it's young people, are putting into their e-cigarettes?
Really good question. So the first thing I would say is that doing any type of studies with young people is quite difficult anyway. But no, I don't know directly of any studies, but I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't know of any studies which have done any content analysis on young people and what they're putting into their e-cigs. The only thing I would say is that there have been studies which have looked at illicit drug use in e-cigarettes. And actually, e-cigarettes are not very good at delivering illicit substances. For a start, they're not designed for that, and they clog up. The tanks and atomizers are quite delicate devices. They're made for nice fluid liquids. So in work that we've done, specifically around the homeless population, we've been told that people had tried it to put other substances in and it broke their device. And then Kirsty Saw, who you know, Chris, from East London, she's done some work on vaping of other substances. And people had mentioned that, again, they had tried to use other substances within their e-cigarette, and it didn't really give them a hit. So I don't know if that's what the question was inferring, but anyway, it does seem that e-cigarettes are not really designed, for other substances. But this is why I think if we are interested in this, we need to be asking people what products they're using to vape anything, and not presume that e-cigarettes are the be all and end all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think actually that perhaps answers a little bit some of the questions, or one of the questions that Norbert has posed.
Norbert Zillatron.
Yes. It says that the CDC have recently explicitly dropped the question of what they vaped from their survey.
Yeah. Hi Norbert. Yeah, I know. It's a problem. We need to be clearer on what it is that people are, what products people are vaping and what substances, because it's making estimates of harm, estimates of risk, population prevalence estimates really difficult. But also there might be some work there for not for me, but for other groups, to help people who are smoking their drugs to vape their drugs. So it's really, this is important. This is another harm reduction important line of work that needs to be explored. But at the moment, what's happening is everything's being clumped under this vaping / e-cigarettes umbrella, and it's not quite as simple as that.
Nothing ever is as simple as that, is it? I mean, that one of the things you realize as you keep going on, it becomes more and more complex as you dig in it. But Norbert has a few other questions.
Okay.
And he says, going back to your slides that was looking at the two studies that looked at the difference between alternative nicotine replacements and the e-cigarettes, a really important question: don't we have any non-user control groups? How are they comparing to those that never used?
So that again, which slides are you talking about?
The slides about the carbon monoxide, etc. The studies that compared e-cigarettes.
There were never users on there. So in study 2, there were never users.
Okay,
yeah.
so
There were never users, and I'm happy to share the slides. But Leon Shahab's papers are now published if people want to have a look at them. Yeah.
So they'll have a more detailed consideration.
And of course, I don't know if I said this, but it's one of my kind of lines that I like to say. E-cigarettes are not harm elimination; they're harm reduction. And that's really important point. That's why they should be used by smokers to quit smoking, and potentially, if they want to vape forever, to stay off smoking. But we don't want to encourage use in never smokers. So they're harm reduction, not elimination. And just because they don't eliminate harm, that doesn't mean they're not a viable alternative.
No, I think that's an important point, that we're looking at harm reduction, because trying to get people to give up, it might be insurmountable, and you've already identified that there are so many reasons why people may continue. And actually, drugs in a wider context, it might be a sensible thing for them to do from their perspective, really rather than from our perspectives.
Yeah, so some interesting data that came out of our NIHR work, where we was offering e-cigarettes versus usual care to adults who were accessing homeless services. In the qualitative piece of work that ran alongside the more quantitative piece of work, some people did suggest that their tobacco use helped them to abstain from other drugs. So that when they have these cravings for other drugs that in the past have led them to have quite severe social problems and health problems, they would have a cigarette. And that helped them to guard against that. So tobacco use is, it's really complex. It's one of the addictions that I think doesn't get enough attention, because it doesn't make people inebriated. It doesn't stop you from picking your kids up from school, but it's so prevalent and it's so complex. And hope what I was able to kind of show is that there are smokers out there that are facing a lot more issues than maybe you or I would if we had tried to quit smoking.
Yeah, indeed. There's some other people got some questions. John's got a question. Any thoughts on how we get these insights into public consciousness to reduce the misconceptions that you've been talking about?
Oh, I know. Yeah, I don't know, John. I keep doing things like this. Which, it does. So I think, I'm not sure if Louise Ross is on this call, but she's an advisor for the NCSCT. And I remember her saying at a conference a couple of years ago, at the moment, it very much feels like we're having to dispel the folklore and rumours on a one-to-one basis. And it still really feels like that. I mean, there are some incredible people in the UK that are doing great amounts of work. And we see charities like Cancer Research UK, which are by far the biggest funders of e-cigarette and other nicotine replacement research. And they run their own reports and reviews. And we've got the Cochrane reviews and wide endorsements. And yet, I think all it really takes, well, not all it takes, but you can do all of that, and then the Sun or other newspapers will run a headline like "vaping as bad as fags," and it really diminishes public trust. And if I can use a more kind of contemporary example, it's what we've been facing a lot, without getting too political in politics. It's people get so confused that they disengage, that there's no point in believing any of it, and it's all a bit murky. So it's a real problem, and I can't answer the question of how we get this into the public consciousness. I think with other harm reduction initiatives, it just takes time.
Can I ask a question? So it's about getting the media on board, I suppose, Sharon.
Yeah, it is. I've spoken to the media, as of my colleagues, a number of times, and one journalist did tell me that vaping stories are great stories because there's goodies and baddies. It's partisan. It creates confusion. It involves the tobacco industry, which are your baddies, and then you've got your you've got your vulnerable victims. So it's this perfect storm for media. I mean, there are some reporters that I have to say do a fantastic job, but again, as I hope I was able to mention in the presentation, this isn't just about poor media reporting. Often some of this is coming from bad science and poorly written press releases.
So Sharon, similar problem with psychedelics, of course.
Yeah.
Loads of myths. So what we decided to do at Drug Science is we're working on a paper at the moment debunking the myths around psychedelics. Let's see the scientific evidence and writing that up. I wonder about something like that for e-cigarettes then. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are things like that do exist out there. And colleagues of mine, my close colleague Lynn Dawkins has done a fantastic public lecture that's available online. If you want more of this, go and have a look at it, around busting the myths of e-cigarettes. And again, I think these sorts of the way that we interact with the general public's important, and we can try and do that. But often I feel like we are preaching to the choir a bit. So it does take a bit more thinking on our behalf, I think, of how we can help to develop this broader understanding, because it is quite nuanced. It's not as clear as I'll speak to friends and they'll say, oh, right, so there are some risks of e-cigarettes. And I'm like, well, yeah, there are some risks, but if you're a smoker, they're far less harmful. Oh, but there are some risks, and aren't they still addictive? But they do still contain nicotine. And we do have, nicotine itself has got a pretty bad reputation. There's wide misperceptions around nicotine. A good study that was published in Tobacco Control 2 years ago by an American group showed that I think it was something like 60% of respondents in this survey believe that nicotine was a carcinogen. And of course it's not. Yeah. but nicotine has really taken the rap for the harms of tobacco over the years.
Yeah. Do you think under the current discussions about vaccinations and the big anti-vax movements that are emerging online, in particular on the social platforms, that there is a reluctance to accept things that are coming out of things like big pharma and the tobacco companies, which have been traditionally had a go at, and that this might actually get in the way of
no, I think that's right. So I think there's a couple of things there. Distrust in industry, generally a distrust in industry, and a distrust where there's shareholders or any vested interests. Now in the UK it's quite good. Our e-cigarette market is fairly independent of the tobacco industry. In the US it's a different story. So that has led some leading public health experts to, I think, widely keep e-cigarettes at a real arm's length, because they are worried about e-cigarettes being this, being a way that you can reignite the tobacco industry. And then there are others that just, even if these products are made by independent industries, that yes, they do make money out of them, any vested interest is enough for some people to say, actually, this isn't something that we should be encouraging. And I have sympathy for that when you look at the behaviour of things like the gambling industry, the tobacco industry still, the alcohol industry, but someone's got to make these products. Someone's got to make them. And we need the products to evolve for the smoker. So this is about good regulation, as opposed to just dismissing anything that's made by any company that we kind of don't like the sound of.
Yeah, fair. I've got a question from Daniel here. It says, are you aware of any current measures to compare electronic cigarettes and cigarette nicotine intake? For example, trying to compare what use on an e-cigarette is equivalent to one cigarette. So I guess he's talking about, how many puffs, how all the measures that we would do around cigarettes. Is the behavioural pattern similar?
Ah, right. No. So you vape differently to how you smoke. Yeah. So this is work that we've been engaged in with myself, Lynn Dawkins, Mark Gonovites. So yes, you do vape differently to how you smoke, and that's a common error when people first start smoking, vaping. That they try to use it in the same way that they smoked. E-cigarettes are now starting to compete with combustible tobacco products in terms of their nicotine delivery, but people still have to vape a lot more to reach that satisfactory blood nicotine level at which they're able to then continue to titrate. So I think, in answer to the question, lab studies, and this is quite hard to do outside of the lab, but lab studies do show that people have to vape more to get satisfactory blood nicotine levels. Unfortunately, this again comes back to one of those myths or misunderstandings. When people do start vaping, they'll be concerned that they're vaping too much, and they'll say, I'm vaping much more than I ever smoked, and there's no beginning or end to my vaping pattern. Whereas a cigarette, there's this clear distinction between smoking episodes. Your cigarette runs out, you put it out, and then that's it, it's done until you start again. With vaping, we can describe it much more as grazing. People will graze on their vape, and that is because at the moment people are not, the devices cannot deliver nicotine to those kind of rapid levels that you'd get. Or it can also be that people, when they try and quit smoking, they'll go for an e-cigarette with an e-liquid with too low a nicotine concentration, because they get in this mindset of, if I'm going to do it, I want to do it properly, and I want to really reduce my nicotine straight away. And then they're using their e-cigarette all the time to maintain these blood nicotine levels that they are more familiar with and used to and feel comfortable with. So
yeah, that's interesting what you're saying about the fact that they're not getting the hit in the same way on their first, and that might be one of the reasons why some of the other compounds might not be as appealing to deliver, our other drugs of abuse, because actually we tend to take drugs that get into the brain massively quick, and it's often a kind of an area that is not considered as much. It's what it does rather than its journey.
So Chris, you know, well, we've had conversations before, you know, my old PhD supervisor, in case people don't know, but when people are, for example, using illicit street drugs and they've, you know, worked quite hard to get them, they're not doing it to get a nice mild high, right? And they're quite expert in the in the delivery of these substances. So yeah, they're not looking always for this nice mild hit that might break their e-cig. They're, you know, there is an intent and there's a purpose there.
Thank you. Another question. Norbert, again, I said, what about possible benefits of nicotine for neurodegenerative diseases? And there's a few psychiatric conditions as well that have been looked at.
So, Norbert, that's not my area of expertise. And I'm not going to answer that because I feel quite strongly that too many people in the e-cigarette field answer questions that they're not experts in, and that leads to more misinformation. So, but I will point you to the work of Paul Newhouse, who has done work in this area. So if that's okay, I think if I'm going to boldly come on to a talk with some set of rules, I need to kind of stick to them.
Nice one. Good answer, Sharon.
But Paul Newhouse, he's the person you need to go to.
I mean, I do know some sort of studies that have happened in the past around things like ADHD, where they've used nicotine replacement, but as patches. And the problem was it wasn't tolerated very well. But that was pediatric populations having adult strength patches slapped on their legs. But I think that Norbert's question is actually, you mentioned the fact that nicotine gets a bad press. It gets lumped in with all the carcinogenic stuff. But actually nicotine as a drug is a potentially useful drug, but it's just got so associated with the addiction side.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, Chris, you're probably more qualified to answer those sorts of questions, but I guess more broadly, is the hard time that nicotine gets maybe meaning that its therapeutic benefits are not taken as seriously or considered? Then I think that might be a case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a similar story that we're going to see with the psychedelics, and also the use of cannabis. That's only just started to have the conversations, really.
So there's these long-held associations with certain substances, and it means that people have a very narrow view of them, and that takes time to change.
Right, I'm just checking through the chat because I may have missed some questions. I think we covered it. Are there any more questions that people wish to put? Maybe if you have one that I've missed out, and that's quite likely that I've missed out, please post.
No, but I now feel comfortable enough to look at the people here, and I know some of them. So hello, and thanks for coming.
You brought your family, have you, Sharon?
My vaping family. And somebody's just put, can I share the slides? Yeah, I'm happy to share any slides with people. Oh, James, Chris, Joanna, how do I share slides?
Just send them to us via email, and
okay,
we can make them available. James is a dab hand at the technical stuff in the background.
Yeah. So if you can quickly email them to me now, then I can quickly upload them to Drive and then put a link in the chat so everyone can get to them nice and easily.
Oh, great. Okay, I can do that. Yeah.
There's just one question, perhaps the last question, I don't know. How do we get the message to disadvantaged populations about the benefits of switching to e-cigarettes?
So really good. That is my research interest. That's what I'm trying to do. And I think one of the ways that we do this, especially within groups of adults who are already well versed in drug harm reduction, we set it against that background. We already have a well-established framework of drug harm reduction. And what we're talking about here is just tobacco harm reduction. And I think when we talk to people about it, as that, as opposed to quitting smoking, which isn't something people are trained in or familiar with, the professionals that support disadvantaged adults really get it. So some training that I've been doing and work with my good colleague, Debbie Robson from King's College London, we have been developing training materials around tobacco harm reduction. And the moment that you talk to people about this dirty needle, clean needle, cigarette, and e-cigarette, they get it. And we talk to people about switching rather than quitting. Yeah. And going back to what I mentioned about some of these groups, they have very little and it's their last pleasure. Don't talk about taking anything away. Talk about switching. Yeah. And talk about giving as opposed to removing. And if we do that, I think we can start to make some headway. Just a bit of a shout out. We've just received some funding actually from the MRC to co-design with people with lived experience of homelessness a tobacco harm reduction toolkit for use within the third sector. So I think that's going to be a really important piece of work, because at the moment people in the third sector don't really have any access to this information, especially that's designed for those groups.
And that's so important, isn't it? Yeah, the great question, Inga. That's from Inga. Yeah. Brilliant.
Hi, Inga.
Right, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to say thank you again, Sharon, for providing us with this talk. It's been fabulous, and it's really been a pleasure to see you and listen to you. Yeah. It's been too long, I can say that.
We'll have to meet up when,
when all this mess is over.
When the apocalypse is finished, we'll meet up.
So yeah, thank you very much, Sharon. And we look forward to seeing you again in some other format, as we're persuading you. And thank you for everybody coming along and listening to this. We'll be having more of these webinars in the future. James will be communicating with you to let you know when the next one is and what it's about. So yeah, keep an eye on the web pages, keep on our Facebook. Oh, James does all the Facebook things.
luckily Chris and I don't do it.
I'm done with all of that.
But Chris, I think the next one is the 8th of January. Is that right, James? At midday, psychedelic, the psychedelic event that was...
Correct. We have, Friday, 8th of January, midday, we have the psychedelic therapy. Then just 6 days after that, on a Thursday, where we need a time zone of me being in Asia, Marcos Bodine from Uruguay and Mafalda Pardel from Belgium, talking about cannabis social clubs and also the legal cannabis situation in Uruguay. I will be sending out information for both of those very shortly.
Great.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, James.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks again, Sharon. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.